chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 3486.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my privilege to open remarks on this important legislation which hold a specific criminal category to account, specifically those who exploit weak border policies to bring crime into the United States. I certainly feel that it is appropriate before I begin my remarks to note that today is the 24th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And in that same vein, Mr. Speaker, this proposed legislation profoundly enables law enforcement to protect us from all threats that seek to enter our country illegally. Let me begin by commending Congresswoman Bice for partnering with me on this important issue. And as to the bill, Mr. Speaker, no matter the type or category, all crime is made worse by illegal immigration. Theft, assault, murder, drug trafficking, human trafficking, violent crime, property crime, you name it, illegal immigration makes it worse. What is perhaps most unfortunate is that many of the worst offenders in this specific category return to the United States after being deported due to gaps in the current immigration law. As a former U.S. prosecutor, I saw how deportation alone is insufficient to deter the committed illegal immigrant criminal. I have investigated, tried, and convicted many individuals who had been deported 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and some even beyond 10 times. Yet they continued to illegally return with the sole intent to commit crime here in the United States. The original version of this bill, Mr. Speaker, was drafted after a 32-year-old woman, an American woman, was tragically murdered by an illegal alien who had 5 felony convictions and had been deported multiple times from the United States. Tragically, her case is not an outlier. It has become far too common. Under the current law, we must wait for a repeat felon, a recidivist illegal alien, to harm another American before we can effectively punish him or her for the crimes they seek to commit. Enough is enough. For any illegal immigrant who has demonstrated a clear and perverse disregard for our law, this bill shows that we will not wait for you to harm another American before we punish you. The act of returning after deportation is a serious crime, and it should denote serious consequences. Further, if you are here illegally, commissioning and being convicted of a felony is not a victimless crime. All felonies have a victim. Enough is enough. In the current state of the law, we must wait for an American to be harmed before significant punishments are issued to those who are here illegally. That is the core motivation of the changes being sought in this bill. Candidly and specifically, if you are here illegally with demonstrated criminal intent, that alone is sufficient to be punished meaningfully in this country. Utilizing my own experience prosecuting this specific class of criminal, this bill implements the following common sense provisions. First, if any illegal alien is found guilty of a state or a federal felony, that alone qualifies the illegal alien for a new federal charge that will bring a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. Secondly, rather than capping the sentence for illegally re-entering, again, this is not the first attempt, illegally re-entering the country at 2 years in prison, which is, again, the current state of the law, the new maximum would become 10 years for all illegal re-entries, regardless of the criminal history that they have. And thirdly, if an illegal alien is convicted of any felony and then deported, and that illegal alien attempts to enter the country illegally again, That will qualify the illegal alien for a new federal charge that carries a minimum of 10 years and up to life in federal prison. I want to make this very clear that this bill does nothing to remove the current immigration authority. If a swift deportation is sought, it can be achieved. If apprehension for an underlying crime and prosecution is sought, that is within the discretion of law enforcement and the prosecutor. This merely adds new tools with which we can fight illegal immigrant criminals. The premise of the bill, Mr. Speaker, begins with the reality that anyone who is in the country illegally is guilty of criminal conduct. However, what triggers the enhanced penalties is either illegal re-entry after deportation, or a felony conviction within the United States. And let me be clear to preempt some of the concerns on the other side of the aisle. This bill adheres to strict and constitutionally protected due process, requiring a conviction in a court of law to trigger the enhanced penalties while leaving room for discretion as the prosecutor deems necessary. Yes, we need the wall. Yes, we need deportations. Yes, we need to remove those who are here illegally, especially those who have committed crimes that harm Americans. The President has shown that these steps are essential. However, from my firsthand experience, from my conversations with these criminals, and from the crime data that is all over this country, sophisticated criminal networks with vast resources extend their reach into America due to the open border policies that the left seems so committed to. It is only through maintaining the policies of this president and strengthening deterrence that we can ensure that illegal immigrant criminals do not continue to flood this country. We must send a message that those around the world who want to come here to commit harm, our tolerance for that activity is over. With the tools in this bill, investigators and prosecutors will be better able to dismantle organized crime rings across America. And most importantly, they will employ an efficient deterrent to anybody who seeks to enter or re-enter this country illegally. It's time for the illegal immigrant criminals to know that we are finished tolerating their presence with the illegal activity that they engage in. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I want to thank Mr. Knott and congratulate him on his first bill coming to the floor of the House. The administration and ICE say that they're targeting the most hardened criminals, the worst of the worst. But the numbers now suggest a different story. Roughly half of the people who've been arrested by ICE have no violent criminal history and no criminal history other than being undocumented. Most migrants, of course, are coming due to poverty, insecurity, violence in their home country, and authoritarianism at home. In fact, the two most common crimes committed by people who've been detained by ICE are being here without documentation and traffic offenses. Now, the president has said that his administration wants to remove and deport people who commit crimes after they illegally enter the country. But the gentleman's legislation moves in exactly the opposite direction. If this bill were passed into law, it would imprison people for long sentences, even potentially for life, just for having entered the country on an undocumented basis, several times, as the gentleman says. That means, obviously, if someone commits a murder or rape, they're going to be prosecuted for murder or rape. So the bite of this bill is with respect to people who just keep re-entering our country without permission. Now, it would require that people who are immediately removable and deportable undocumented immigrants must spend 5 or 10 years in overcrowded and overburdened Bureau of Prison facilities in our country at a huge cost to American taxpayers. More than $150, in many cases $200 a day, which comes to hundreds of millions of dollars when you multiply it by the people that would be affected before they can be removed from the country. And that's the odd part of this bill, that we have people who've entered unlawfully, who have no documentation to be here. They're removable, they're deportable, but we're insisting that they stay here and be imprisoned and punished here for the crime of having entered illegally. And this would undoubtedly be good for the owners of all the private detention facilities and prisons who are getting rich off of laws like this, but it would fail the rest of us. Under 8 U.S.C. 1325 today, entering the U.S. without inspection is already a misdemeanor punishable by a fine and a sentence of up to 6 months in prison with enhancements that can increase the maximum sentence up to 2 years. Under 8 U.S.C. 1326, if you unlawfully re-enter the country or found to be here in the United States following a removal or denial of admission, this is already a felony, punishable by up to 2 years in prison, with enhancements that can increase the maximum sentence already to as high as 20 years in prison for those who were ordered removed following a conviction for certain offenses. So, the gentleman's bill would increase the penalty for people who enter without inspection from 6 months to 2 years for a first offense, and then if you re-enter without documentation, to up to 5 years, and in certain circumstances, potentially up to life. You could be held for life for a consecutive illegal entry into our country. So the bill provides, even for a potential life sentence in federal prison for merely entering the country unlawfully, with no other criminal conduct required. There are obviously armed robbers and rapists and even murderers who have done less time than that. Obviously, we don't want these people entering the country illegally. That's why the solution is to toughen the border. And we had a bipartisan compromise to toughen and fortify the border with the hiring of hundreds more border officers and judges. It was coming through the Senate, and that was the one at the end of 2024 that was sailing through Congress when President Trump decided to sink that legislation and said essentially he didn't want a border compromise bill for more effective enforcement there. He wanted a border crisis to run against. So, look, there's been a consensus between the parties for several years that mandatory minimums do not effectively reduce crime and do not improve public safety. They strip judges of their ability to exercise fact-based discretion and impose sentences that fit the circumstances of the case, frustrating their ability to consider mitigating and complicating factors, imposing a one-size-fits-all straitjacket that leads to often disproportionate and inflexible prison sentences. This is why the Judicial Conference itself opposes mandatory minimums. This is why you don't have judges at the border demanding the gentleman's legislation. This is why the Brennan Center opposes it. This is why Right on Crime has opposed mandatory minimums, and so on. Study after study has shown that mandatory minimums don't work to deter criminal conduct. We know from a report issued by the Department of Justice's National Institute of Justice that the certainty of being caught and quickly punished, not the severity or length of the sentence, is what deters criminal conduct. Increasing and mandating harsh, lengthy sentences will not deter illegal re-entry, but strengthening the border will do that. According to the Washington Post, the administration is actually pressuring governors today to commute the sentences of immigrants who are in prison under the current framework, convicted of serious crimes. And I'm not talking about just entering without documentation. I'm talking about serious crimes, and the administration is pushing for them to have their sentences commuted so ICE can take custody of them and then remove them from the country more quickly. So the gentleman's bill does the exact opposite. It requires that deportable immigrants be held in our prisons at enormous public expense for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, in some circumstances, even for life, making the taxpayers pay for it when they could have simply been removed and deported, which has been the policy of this administration. The gentleman's bill, which was opposed on a bipartisan basis in committee, is ultimately too punitive, way too expensive, and ultimately ineffective. I will urge our colleagues to oppose the legislation with all due respect to my friend, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Harris.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I applaud my colleague, Representative Knott, for bringing forth this important legislation. You know, Mr. Speaker, if we reward illegals for breaking our laws, we cannot be surprised when it continues to happen. I rise today in support of H.R. 3486, the Stop Illegal Entry Act, legislation to increase penalties for aliens who commit serious crimes, as well as those who enter illegally more than once. We all know under the Biden administration, illegal aliens were welcomed with open arms. They were given hotel rooms, cell phones, plane tickets, work authorization. I'm glad to report those days are over. House Republicans are united behind President Trump's efforts to secure our border, strengthen our immigration enforcement, and fix our immigration system. Earlier this year, House Republicans made a once-in-a-generation investment in our immigration system. We gave our immigration officers the resources they need to properly enforce our immigration laws and carry out necessary deportations. Today, we're building upon that work with this proposed law to provide a strong deterrent against those coming here illegally in the first place. With these enhanced punishments in place, people will think twice before breaking our laws and choosing to overwhelm our immigration system. The harsher the punishment, the more the deterrence. That's just common sense. A nation that cannot control its borders cannot protect its people. This legislation affirms the rule of law, defends American families from dangerous criminal aliens, and restores accountability to our immigration system. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yes, and I will yield 7 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from the state of Washington, who's the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 3486. This bill is Republicans' latest attempt to scapegoat and fearmonger about immigrants. With President Trump's poll numbers tanking on immigration due to his kidnapping and disappearing of immigrants and U.S. citizens off our streets, House Republicans are once again looking to turn the conversation back to immigration and the border. Let me point out the absurdity of spending this valuable floor time on a bill that has harsh, ineffective, mandatory minimums for immigrants, while the majority affects one of the greatest cover-ups of our time, covering up the horrific abuses of Jeffrey Epstein and his network of child traffickers and sexual predators. Why not spend our time focused on justice for the incredibly brave survivors who have spoken out against the rich and powerful men that abuse them? Why fight a bipartisan discharge petition from Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna to release all the damn files, not just the ones that the Trump's DOJ allows to be released? Why not speak out against the cushy deal that Ghislaine Maxwell just got from Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche to move to a cushy prison instead of serving her time as one of Epstein's main co-conspirators and groomers of young girls to be abused by Epstein and his cohort of rich and powerful men. Obviously, once again, my colleagues across the aisle want to try and distract us by returning to their tried and true playbook of demonizing immigrants. That is not actually what the American people want. We have seen over and over again the American people actually support immigration, despite all the lies that come from the other side. This summer, a Gallup poll noted a record high 79% of U.S. adults saying immigration is a good thing for the country. A Pew poll showed 60% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's suspension of most asylum applications, which was ruled unlawful in federal court. The American people now see that the Trump administration has continually lied about what they're going to do on immigration. According to a CBS poll, a majority of Americans believe that the Trump administration is not prioritizing the removal of dangerous criminals and public safety threats, and nearly 60% disapprove of how the Trump administration is using immigration detention facilities. This is not surprising in the least. As the ranking member said, ICE's own data revealed that roughly 65% of people in immigration detention have zero criminal convictions. Zero. It is clear that this administration is not targeting the so-called worst of the worst, as President Trump claimed on the campaign trail. Instead, they are targeting everyone they think they may be able to deport. Tom Homan, the president's so-called border czar, said that arresting non-criminals is, quote, our job. In Los Angeles, ICE has been racially profiling people, indiscriminately arresting and holding people, causing fear and terror in people of all legal statuses who simply look Latino or speak Spanish or congregate on certain corners. Today's bill is just more of the same scapegoating and lying about immigrants. Once again, the majority implies that somehow we don't already have consequences for unlawful entry and reentry. That is absolutely false. Current law already includes harsh sentences and are some of the most prosecuted laws in our country every single year. This bill would add ridiculous mandatory minimum sentences, going up to life potentially, onto the crimes of unlawful entry and reentry. Now, this makes no sense on multiple levels. If the administration is seeking to deport, quote, the worst of the worst, why put them in incarceration facilities? Perhaps this is just another ploy to give private for-profit prison companies more money so they can build more facilities, make more profit, and ultimately contribute more to the Republican campaign coffers. In addition, as the ranking member said in his statement, mandatory minimums just do not work. We have actually seen this over and over again. Harsh enforcement is not the answer. I don't know why my colleagues are having such a hard time with this. The first Trump administration actually tried to weaponize unlawful entry prosecutions by separating over 5,000 children from their parents. The entire country, Republican, Independent, and Democrat, was horrified at this, and the administration ultimately had to abandon their family separation policy. But still today, over 1,000 of these kids remain separated from their parents. And yet, despite this despicable, absurdly cruel policy, a 2018 study found zero statistically significant relationship between the family separation policy and the number of apprehensions at the border. These kinds of indiscriminate, harsh enforcement efforts are a waste of taxpayer dollars and detrimental to the kind of country that we are trying to create. The U.S. already has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and it costs U.S. taxpayers about $182 billion every year, not to mention the social cost to lock up nearly 1% of the adult population. This bill would skyrocket that number. Now, actually, it was during the first Trump term that Republicans joined Democrats in actually rolling back some mandatory minimum sentences in the First Step Act that was signed by, guess who? President Donald Trump himself in 2018. But I guess all good policy is once again falling to the feet of the divisive political rhetoric around immigrants and crime that my colleagues across the aisle have embraced as their salvo to save them from the bleak economic picture our country faces today. Higher joblessness, Trumpflation, a host of reckless policies, including trade wars, that have cost the American people. The Republican big bad betrayal bill is unpopular everywhere in the country, no matter how you spin it, because Americans know that kicking 17 million Americans off of health care just so you can give a $7 trillion tax break to the wealthiest billionaire donors and giant corporations is outrageous, and the American people want us to roll it back. One more minute.
Additional 30 seconds.
In just 19 days, government funding expires. Right now, Americans across the country face rural hospitals that are closing, higher prices for back-to-school supplies, double-digit increases in healthcare premiums, and the Republican majority, what are we spending our time on? This terrible bill. What a giant abdication of the huge responsibility that the American people put on us here in Congress. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
And we reserve. Thank you.
Madam Speaker,
Reserves.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman.
Is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Schmidt.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And our colleagues on the other side think if they just talk about enough other things long enough, the clock will run out, and that the American people will forget the disaster that the policies of the prior administration created not just on our border, but throughout our communities in this country for the prior 4 years. Well, they're mistaken. We're not going to forget. And we're not going to stop until we fix the holes in our law that enabled bad policies to drive through them. That is what this bill is about. This bill is about focusing on the worst of the worst. It is about focusing on those who are not deterred under current law by the threat of a 2-year prison sentence, perhaps because they're being paid by the cartels or enabled by the cartels, and the risk is worth it. That's who this is aimed at. That's why a 5 to 10-year prison sentence is warranted, valid, and necessary. Madam Speaker, I want to share just one story from my home state of Kansas about why we care about this issue. It's just one example. In March of 2016, Pablo Antonio Serrano Vitorino, an illegal alien from Mexico, shot and killed 4 people in my state. And then while fleeing from law enforcement, he killed another person in Missouri. And here's the kicker. It wasn't his first time in the country. It wasn't his first crime in our country. In 2004, he was convicted in California of making a terrorist threat. He was deported, and he came back. And in the years that ensued, he encountered law enforcement when he committed battery, when he committed drunk driving, when he committed traffic infractions. And he came back, and he stayed. Now, I can't say with certainty that if ICE had done their job and shown up, if the prosecutors had actually prosecuted, if the law were tough enough, none of that would have happened. But I can sure say the odds are much better that those 4 people, those 5 people, might still be alive. And I can certainly say that justice would have been done. So this bill's a good first step. We need to do it. It's the right thing.
Gentleman's time is expired.
I encourage all of my colleagues to support it.
I yield 10 seconds.
The gentleman yields.
I thank my colleagues. Let me just say, I hope we don't stop here. Let's put this on the President's desk. Let's keep going and finish the job. Thank you. I yield.
I reserve the balance.
And from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. My friend and the good gentleman from Kansas says that the legislation is about the worst of the worst. And I beg to differ. The worst of the worst are already covered by existing law. If you commit a murder, like the gruesome murder he describes in his state, you can go to jail for life, and in many states, and I suppose Kansas, but I don't know, you're subject to the death penalty. If you commit rape, armed robbery, there are laws that cover that. And today, under Section 1326, if you have committed an aggravated felony, such as the kind that he describes, you already can be imprisoned an additional 20 years under the immigration statute. So I understand that it might be satisfying for us to say, we're just going to increase all these penalties, but we're not in any way connecting with the worst of the worst. What are we really doing? We're saying that we're going to hold people who've done nothing other than enter the country illegally for much longer periods of time, for 5 years or 10 years. And again, we see this as very wasteful in terms of public tax dollars. So if you set aside the murderers, the rapists, the armed robbers who we're going to get under existing laws that make all of that criminal, and you look at what's actually happening here, it's a focus on people who are entering the country illegally. And we have to ask ourselves, is it economically worthwhile to us to say that we're so mad at those people, we want to hold them in our jails for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or even life in certain circumstances, rather than send them back to their own country and toughen the border so they can't get back in, which is precisely the purpose of the legislation that was rejected at the end of 2024 on toughening up the border. We should go back and do that rather than having people continually come back in. I now am delighted to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Representative Correa.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, strongly oppose this measure. Let me repeat, re-entry into this country is already a felony. Bottom line, if you're a hardcore criminal, with or without documents, you should be fried, period. The one thing about this bill that is lacking is simply this. We don't talk about the big magnet. What's the big magnet for people coming into this country? Jobs. People come to work. We need the workers. Wisconsin dairy farmers. 90% of those workers, up to 90% of those dairy workers at those Wisconsin dairies are undocumented. Manufacturing, farm workers, food processing. Who takes care of our seniors? Mainly undocumented workers. Ask my colleagues, is there anything in this bill going after the employers? What about when those undocumented are deported and they come back to the U.S.? Do you say to those employers, you are going to be double down, double felony, you're going to go to prison for life? That's the big issue here. Who's going to do those jobs? Solution, I ask my colleagues on the other side, let's work on immigration reform. Let's get some visas going for these workers. Instead, the situation we have right now, you tell employers, go ahead and hire an undocumented, because you don't have any others to hire. That's the only way you stay in business. But when you do that, you're essentially breaking the law. You give them the other option. Mr. Employer, fire those undocumented. And guess what? You'll go out of business. That is the scenario we have right now. Let me conclude by telling you a story about my district as well. Mr. Barreto, 25 years in this country, not a traffic ticket to his name. Was at the Home Depot, doing what he's supposed to do. Buy parts to do a job. Got picked up by ICE. His son called me. This man has 3 sons. All 3 are serving in the U.S. Marine Corps. Alejandro just finished honorable discharge. The 2 others are still in the Marine Corps in California. Now, what do you tell the American public when you tell them that the father of 3 Marines that took an oath to defend this country, to make the ultimate sacrifice for this country, we are deporting your father because he's a criminal? Come on. I asked Alejandro, I said, Alejandro, at Camp Pendleton, are there other Marines in your situation? He said, yes.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman's time has expired.
I will extend the gentleman an additional 60 seconds.
The gentleman is
There are
recognized.
many Marines right now whose parents are undocumented, who are ready to lay down their lives for this country. My colleagues in the other aisle, work on immigration reform. This does nothing to strengthen our country, national defense. It hurts our economy. Why are we going down this path? Let's get serious about immigration reform, pass some laws that enable workers to work legally, and let employers hire these workers legally as well. Thank you very much.
And I thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, for his very trenchant and powerful remarks, and we will reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, it's my privilege to yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Oklahoma, Ms. Bice.
And yields, and the gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of my legislation, H.R. 3486, the Stop Illegal Entry Act. Let me first start by saying I think it's rich that we stand here on the House floor and are lectured by the other side of the aisle about immigration issues when they had the last 4 years to actually address this problem. They want to deflect, as my colleague from Kansas mentioned. Let's talk about all of the other things that have been happening in the country instead of the actual issue at hand. Under the Biden administration, over 10 million illegal immigrants entered this country. This includes countless numbers of murderers, rapists, child traffickers, smugglers, and individuals from countries that support terrorism. Customs and Border Patrol caught 400 individuals on the terror watch list, leaving us the question of who else was allowed to enter this country undetected. That is why the Stop Illegal Entry Act is so important. The legislation seeks to discourage migrants from coming to the U.S. illegally and keeps criminal aliens who disregard federal immigration law out of our American communities. It is vital that law enforcement officers and Border Patrol officers have the tools they need to hold dangerous criminals accountable and safeguard our communities, and this legislation does just that. President Trump has delivered on his promise to secure the border, and this legislation provides the tools needed to uphold our laws and remove dangerous criminals. On that note, I was also encouraged to see a statement of administrative support from the Office of Management and Budget, stating that if the legislation were presented to the president, his advisors would recommend that he sign it into law. Finally, I am not an attorney, but I want to thank my friend, Congressman Knott, for his support in helping get this legislation through the Judiciary Committee. As a former prosecutor, I know he understands the importance of strong policies that safeguard our communities and empower law enforcement. With that, Madam Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to submit the Statement of Administrative Policy into the record.
Without objection.
With that, Madam Speaker, I urge the passage of this important legislation to hold those accountable that are here illegally, and with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance.
From North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to underscore something that the gentleman from California said. The whole weight of this bill is on people who are not the hardened criminals. Obviously, we're going to be prosecuting rapists for rape and murderers for murder and so on. He talked about people who are hardworking immigrants, the kind even President Trump described when for a moment he said there wouldn't be immigration raids on farms because the agricultural sector is in crisis and people are saying we need the workers. Well, I wanted to echo what President Trump said briefly there before he was corrected by Mr. Miller. I was just up in upstate New York in Adirondacks in the 21st Congressional District. I represented by Ms. Stefanik. And I met a bunch of dairy farmers there. Told me it was impossible for them to find workers to work the farms. And with the additional crackdown on migrant labor, it's pretty much impossible for them to get the workers they need. So what's the economic result of that? Well, they take the citizen laborers they've got and they do mandatory overtime. So they're working an additional 15, 20, 30 hours a week. Then they've got to pay them time and a half under the Federal Labor Standards Act. So the prices go up now because they're not able to find enough workers to satisfy the demand. Their choice at that point is either to pay the farmers less money, which they can't do because the farmers are already at the breaking point, or they've got to increase prices. And that's what they end up doing. And they've said to the groceries, this is because Congress refuses to work on bipartisan immigration reform. That's why we're seeing inflation in dairy, in produce, and across the agricultural sector. So the gentleman is telling us if we're serious about dealing with this, we need to do what we started to do at the end of 2024. We need to have bipartisan commitment to immigration reform, and we need to sit down and work this out the way that prior generations of Americans have done. This is a country that's been built on immigration. So I'm afraid that the gentleman's legislation here, which is basically just jacking up a whole series of criminal penalties, doesn't get us out of the economic problems and the immigration policy problems that we're in. And so it's a distraction. It will be ineffectual. And so it's not going to work to deal with the real crisis that we're facing. I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Just briefly, Madam Speaker, before I recognize my friend from Utah, I will say that the colleague from my friend from Maryland mentioned robbery and rape and murder. This bill's goal is to apprehend dangerous criminals before they rob, rape, or murder Americans. And secondly, and most importantly, referencing a farm worker, if they're here illegally and they do not commit a felony, this bill does not touch them. The only standard that this bill has, do not come back into the country a second time illegally and do not get convicted of a felony. How low do you think of the farm workers that they cannot meet that standard? With that, I will yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Utah.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of Representative Bice's Stop Illegal Entry Act of 2025, and I applaud my colleague, Representative Knott, for his role in this important piece of legislation. For too long, open border policies have left American families at risk. Under the Biden administration, the vast majority of those charged with illegal reentry already had criminal records. And in Utah, we've seen the consequences firsthand. This July in Salt Lake County, a 43-year-old Mexican national was sentenced for drug trafficking and illegal reentry. He had been deported 3 times before, and when he was arrested, he carried an illegal firearm and more than 9,000 fentanyl pills. In May, ICE officers in Utah apprehended and removed an illegal immigrant from Guatemala who was facing charges of aggravated sexual assault of a child under the age of 14, after previously being caught and removed twice before. In January, a 24-year-old Mexican national was charged with the murder of his girlfriend in Utah just 1 week after being deported for the second time. These are not isolated cases. They are just a few recent examples from my home state, and there are countless more heartbreaking stories from across the country. It is clear that the current penalties are not enough to deter this dangerous cycle of illegal reentry. The safety and security of our citizens must never be compromised by those who abuse our system and exploit our borders. H.R. 3486 protects American families, upholds the rule of law, and keeps our nation secure by setting real penalties for those who seek to enter our great nation illegally to commit crimes. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and reserves.
I reserve. Thank you.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Madam Speaker, thank you. I'm yielding 2 minutes now to the very distinguished lady from California and member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 3486. Let's be clear, this bill is not about border security. It is about pouring gasoline on a prison system that is already bloated, broken, and unjust. While American families are begging us to release the Epstein files, to lower grocery prices, to keep doctors' offices open, to confront mass shootings, Republicans have chosen to waste our time and taxpayer dollars on a bill that criminalizes what is already a crime under federal law. This legislation would impose draconian mandatory minimums, even life sentences, for nonviolent acts like returning to reunite with loved ones. That is not justice, that is cruelty. We should be investing in humane immigration policies, not building more cages. Expanding prisons has never made us safer. It rips families apart, disproportionately targeting Black and brown communities, and it deepens cycles of poverty and punishment that we should be dismantling, not expanding. Mandatory minimums don't deter migration. They tie judges' hands, treat every case the same, and devastate communities. We don't need harsher prison sentences. We need pathways and solutions that actually work. H.R. 3486 is punitive, expensive, and unnecessary. It is waste, it is fraud, it is abuse. And I urge my colleagues to stop scapegoating immigrants, stop playing politics with people's lives, and vote no on this cruel and cynical bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
We reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my privilege to recognize my colleague from North Carolina, yielding him 2 minutes, Mr. Moore.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I had some prepared remarks, but as I've talked about this and looked at it even more, this is probably one of the most common sense bills that will come before this Congress. This bill simply says if someone re-enters or someone commits a felony, that this law applies. These comments from the other side to try to confuse this issue, to misrepresent, make no sense. Surely, of all of the things in the world that we can disagree on, perhaps we can at least agree that we should not be allowing felons in this country, and that when someone is here illegally and commits a felony, that this law ought to apply. Have not the events of the last recent days shown that we have enough problems already? Why would we want to have felons in this from outside this country to come in? You know, I think about what we were talking about a few days ago back in North Carolina. My colleague, Mr. Knott, Mr. Harris are here with the senseless murder of the young Ukrainian lady on the light rail line. Turns out, by the way, that she and her family live in my district. And then, of course, the senseless murder yesterday, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and violence and evil that's all around us. This is one step to try to prevent and stem even more of that possibly happening by dealing with dangerous folks, not just folks who come across the border for the first time and are dealt with in the normal thing, but to deal with folks who are committing serious felonies. This should be common sense. This is the kind of bill, Mr. Knott, that should get 435 votes on the floor of this House. I hope my colleagues on the other side will reflect on this, will reconsider, and will do the right thing, and will vote for this bill. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
We reserve the balance.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
We have no more speakers, Madam Speaker, and we're prepared to close.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we have no further speakers, and I am prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've got just one quick correction or amendment to my distinguished friend's last set of remarks, which is that when he says, how low a standard must there be, all they have to do is not commit another felony or commit a felony. As I understand the gentleman's legislation, and please correct me if I'm wrong because he certainly knows it better than I do, but it is a felony to come back to the country, again, without having committed any violent crime or any other offense. It becomes a felony under the legislation. So now you have a felony because you've re-entered, and at that point, you're eligible for the up to 20 years or even a life sentence. Am I understanding that correctly? There are people whose only offense could be re-entering without anything else who would be subject to the most serious punishment. And I'm happy to yield if you can just clarify that.
Well,
the gentleman yields. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
The issue with your characterization, sir, is number one, someone who enters illegally must be convicted of illegally entering the country. Then they must be convicted of illegally re-entering a country to get a felony conviction. There is no compulsion to charge the most serious layers of this offense. There is prosecutorial discretion. Under this law, if someone is apprehended, they can be deported without any charging. And that's where the misconception and the mischaracterization is. And now if someone is convicted of illegal reentry and deported, and they come back, a prosecutor would have the discretion to charge the 10-year minimum. It's not compulsory, it is within the discretion. But yes, he would meet the element.
All right, I'll reclaim my time.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yeah, but thank you for that clarification. I'm satisfied to believe, again, that there are people who could end up with the most severe penalties under the legislation who've done nothing other than re-enter the country, which is something we don't want them to do, which is why we want a bipartisan immigration bill to actually fasten down the border and move forward on this so we're not constantly dealing with this way. The bottom line problem with my friend's legislation, which is offered in all good faith, is that it's just continuing to pile criminal penalties on people re-entering the country without changing any of the incentives or inducements. It doesn't deal with any of the things pushing them out of countries that are marked by gang violence and authoritarianism, so on, nor is it dealing, as Mr. Correa points out, with the pull of all of the jobs here. So we need real immigration policy breakthroughs and not just piling on a bunch of additional criminal penalties that are not going to work, and if they did, would just end up costing the American taxpayers hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in holding people in our prison for offenses that currently they're being held for 6 months or for up to 2 years. So with that, we're going to urge people to vote no on the gentleman's legislation, and I'm happy to yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've heard a lot from the other side about costs, whether it be costs to law enforcement, costs to imprison, cost to society, but I want to talk about the cost of open border policies that is felt in this country. In the year 1990, roughly 5,000 Americans died because of illegal drug use. Since the year 2000, almost 1.5 million Americans have lost their life because of using illegal drugs. Now, of course, there is involvement locally and domestically in the drug trade, but just about all drugs, statistically all illegal drugs, come into the country illegally. That's just one category dealing with the cost of illegal immigration. Any criminal code should have 3 objectives. First, it should protect Americans. It should protect American children. It should protect American families, neighborhoods, businesses from the ill effects of crime. Second, it should punish illegal activity. When someone harms another American, there should be adequate and reciprocal punishment. It should be efficient, and it should work, again, to protect Americans. Thirdly, it should deter ongoing criminal conduct in that same vein, repeat criminal offenses, or anyone who would want to copy criminal conduct to enrich themselves. When you look at the scale of illegal immigration, when you look at the problems that are being inflicted upon this country, across every metric, the criminal law is failing to protect Americans. This bill, again, it aims to target the committed criminals who are here illegally. There is no distinction under the current law for people who commit crimes when they are here illegally versus those who commit crimes who are citizens. That discrepancy enables hordes of illegal immigrants to come from around the world to harm Americans. Again, I repeat, Mr. Raskin, in good faith and with sound logic, he talked about robbery, he talked about property crimes, he talked about rape and murder. Some of these people have been convicted of rape, murder, property crimes after they have been deported. They return illegally and harm Americans. This bill aims to preempt the harm Americans feel by committed illegal immigrant criminals. Just this week, there was a release from the Department of Homeland Security, a 34-year-old gang member from Mexico. He had illegally entered the country 26 times. He has received convictions for burglary, tampering with government records, government witnesses, criminal enterprises, illegal re-entry, multiple times. When you look at cases like this that are so voluminous it's hard to summarize, again, the only conclusion, the law is insufficient as it is currently drafted. We are in Congress to make laws to protect Americans. When we have such gaping holes in our criminal justice law as it relates to illegal immigrant criminals, not dairy workers, not those who are not committing crimes, the conclusion is straightforward. We need to change the law. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, candidly, are twisting themselves into circles to defend the policies of the status quo. They want more illegal immigrants. They do not want stricter enforcement. They are turning every opportunity to resist the changes that Republicans and this president are trying to implement. Again, as a federal prosecutor in my previous career, I saw how illegal, unchecked immigration harmed every corner of my state and the country. When you have an open flow of illegal immigration, crime flourishes. It is hard to quantify the cost. Again, with this bill, for any illegal immigrant to be under its effect, they must commit a felony and get convicted, or they must illegally re-enter, not enter, re-enter after deportation. That is not a standard too high. That is not detached from logic. Again, when you look at the goals of what all criminal laws should achieve, protecting Americans, punishing illegal activity, and to deter repeat offenses, this is a needed step to accompany the legitimate approach that the president has been implementing over the past few years. I urge my colleagues to vote in its favor. Thank you.